The idea of the Russian world was developed in the early 2000s by the main bunker dwarf of our time, still the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Its essence was to manipulate concepts such as the Orthodox faith, East Slavic roots, and the Russian language in an attempt to unite the three countries of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. However, the so-called unification had a completely different goal, namely, total submission to Moscow and the use of the country's resources by Moscow to line the pockets of Moscow's ruling elite. Someone simply forgot that in the 21st century, to build up a country, you don't need to seize other people's territories, but you need to improve life in the lands you already have. Today, I will show vivid examples of what this fairy tale Russian world really is and how people live in Russia itself. If anyone doubts the accuracy, believe me, this is the pure truth. You can look it up, Google it, and check all the information yourself. And I'm saying this now because, as a resident of Ukraine, when I read about this kind of mess, I honestly couldn't believe this could be happening in the 21st century, but I won't keep you waiting. My name is Semen, this is the Micah Show TV channel, let's get started. He drowned, though not exactly in water. The first story happened in the city of Murmansk. It's a fairly large city with a population of almost 300,000. It's not a remote little village. This is the reality of ordinary modern Russia. A man who lived in a half-collapsed house without any amenities, while half-drunk, went to the toilet and drowned there. The harshest part of this situation is that his drinking buddies knew he had fallen through in the toilet and was lying there. However, they decided they were powerless. One of them said he forgot the emergency services number, so the best friends just kept drinking instead of pulling their buddy out. It's not exactly known how long the man lay in the pit before he died. In the morning, he was noticed by a neighbor from the dormitory who was going out for beer. In the morning, for beer. You know, it feels like I'm just making up some crazy stuff. But no, this is just regular news material from Russia. That's how all of Russia lives, except for St. Petersburg and Moscow, because people in those cities live well precisely because the rest of the country lives in, well, you get the idea. So they called the rescuers, but even after that, they couldn't get the already dead body out for a long time, because no one had cleaned the cesspit for many years. If Putin cared about his people, he would have done everything to prevent this. Instead, he chose a different path. Before moving on to the next stories that will give you goosebumps, I want to ask you a few questions. While preparing this material, we accidentally discovered some shocking numbers. And this is Russians' own statistics, not the ever-deceitful West. Try to answer the following questions in the comments. First, what percentage of Russians do not have sewage systems? Second, what percent of Russians lack a toilet at home? And third, the last one, the first and second questions, but now for rural residents. Write in the comments. It will be interesting to know your opinion, and if you want to know the correct answer, it will be in our post on our Telegram channel. Don't forget to subscribe. A dog's life. The second story fully reveals the level of education of Russians. In the summer of 2019, dogs began to disappear in the city of Dzerzhinsk, Nizhny Novgorod region. As it turned out, some residents of the city were catching animals in order to make various dishes out of them. Yes, you heard that right. This is news from Channel 1 of the Russian Federation, but they definitely wouldn't lie, right? One woman stood out in particular who sincerely believed that dog meat was saving her husband from tuberculosis. She looked for puppies through volunteer ads and didn't even hide the fact that she would use them as food. It seems that not everyone in Russia knows that there is medicine and hospitals. After all, this isn't the only such case in Russia. If in a civilized society a dog is man's best friend, a family member, and a loyal helper, then in this country it's just a piece of meat running around the street for free. Resort towns of Russia. Russian propaganda shamelessly claims that Russia is a great country, and its citizens sincerely believe that they live better than people do in the decaying West. Nevertheless, the reality of life in the Russian Federation is more than deplorable. Welcome to Chita, a city that's basically a garbage dump. The residents don't even try to change the situation in any way. They find it most convenient to live among the rotting garbage, which fills the yard with a heavy, sour smell. You might ask, is it really possible that among a population of 300,000 people, there isn't anyone who cares? Maybe there are such people, but the Russian authorities don't care at all about how their ordinary people live, or rather, survive. A similar situation can be seen in the recently mentioned city of Murmansk. The locals have a particular habit of getting rid of their trash by throwing it out the windows. This is observed not just in 1 or 10 buildings in this city, but in many places. The residents talk about this openly and don't see any problems with it. It just seems to me that after seeing things like this, the exclusion zone looks much more attractive and livable. A real Russian teacher. If you thought the previous stories about Russian life were a total horror show, what you're about to hear next will definitely cause much more than just shock. In April 2015, a music teacher from the Moscow region ordered the murder of her student. According to the woman, she had a relationship with the schoolboy. She gave him gifts and paid all kinds of attention to him. No one was alarmed by the excessive interest of a 50-year-old woman in a 14-year-old boy. The reason why this creature decided to take the life of her student was jealousy, because the boy started dating a girl his own age. When hiring a hitman, the teacher promised a payment of 100,000 rubles. But one of the conditions was that she had to see the child suffer. Her exact words were, "Break his legs, damage his kidneys, I want to see him suffer." As you can see, occupiers are taught excessive cruelty and inhumanity as early as school. Krasnoye, the indifferent village. And now news from Krasnoye Selo. And don't let the name confuse you. It's not a village, but a city with a population of about 70,000 people. In Russia, a young man felt unwell in the middle of the street, but people just walked by with indifference. Only after 30 minutes did someone finally think to call an ambulance. However, it was already too late. He died. After the news was published, it was very sad to read the comments. Before moving on to the next incredible story, here, take a look. That's right, Russia doesn't abandon its own. And here are some of the comments. My uncle rode the subway for an hour lying on the floor. Stroke. And this was during rush hour, and nobody cared. A person in an expensive coat and tuxedo, well-groomed. This is the modern crazy world. No, my friend, this isn't the modern world. This is Russia. Nothing surprising. This says a lot about our mentality. About 5 years ago, they did an experiment. A person would fall, pretending to feel unwell, in America and Europe. People would immediately run up to help. In Russia, people just stepped over and walked by. In Moscow, someone pretended to help, but actually picked his pocket. Apparently, that's that famous, generous Russian soul. Yeah, that's exactly what the Russian world is like. And I had an incident when I was 9 months pregnant. I slipped and fell in the winter. The bags of groceries flew everywhere, and my legs, my knees twisted in such a way that I couldn't get up. Only one woman came by. She asked me if I needed help. And I said very quietly from the pain that yes, I did. But she just smiled and without coming closer, walked away. I remember that I started crying from the pain and probably from the hurt that no one helped me. I could barely get my legs under me. I crawled on my knees, gathered the bags, and somehow managing to stand up, hobbled home. In the end, it turned out to be a meniscus tear in one of my knees for sure. I think I injured my other knee too. So people can just walk past a pregnant woman, let alone anyone else. Terrible. I experienced it myself. 6 years ago, I was walking home from work, suddenly felt unwell. In October, I ended up lying in a puddle under pouring rain. I lay next to a curb in the square for 40 minutes. It was a stroke. I was dressed very well. People just walked by. Several cars honked. Oh, look how drunk she is. But I couldn't speak, and I couldn't get up. I was lying there and saw people walking by. Luckily, one woman recognized me. Thanks to her, I'm alive. That's how it is here in Krasnoye Selo. I remember how the ambulance crew cursed at me. I called them because someone had fallen and hit the back of their head on the curb. There was a lot of blood. He was lying there, groaning and wheezing. And the ambulance arrived and said, "If you feel sorry for a drunk, take him yourself. And we can even fine you for a false call." Mommy. In the city of Chita, a 60-year-old man kept his mother's corpse in his apartment for 3 years. He wanted to turn her body into a mummy. Oh, But after reading advice on the internet about this topic, during this period he sprinkled the body with salt. As it turned out, this was done so that the body wouldn't decompose and there wouldn't be a strong odor. The residents of the building noticed the strange behavior of their already secretive neighbor and the fact that the woman hadn't been seen for as long as 3 years. The neighbors called the police officer so he could find out what was happening in the apartment. When the police officer arrived at the address, he found the mummified body of a woman in the middle of the room. It turned out that the man didn't like traditional burial practices. That's why he came up with this method. According to him, he loved his mother very much and didn't want to part with her. Later, it came to light that all these years, the son had been receiving a pension of 16,000 rubles by proxy. According to law enforcement, this was the main motive for such behavior. The deceased woman also had a daughter, who only learned about her mother's death after the event received significant publicity on television and social media. I'm saying this now, and I'm completely shocked. 3 years, damn it. The person hadn't been in touch and nobody noticed, not even her own daughter. Freedom of speech, Russian style. In Ukraine, everyone is used to being able to freely express their opinion on any topic. More than once, comedians have mocked politicians for their absurdity on comedy TV shows, and journalists have asked provocative questions without fear. In Russia, the situation is completely different. The country's censorship restricts citizens so much that even a small gathering of people attracts the attention of law enforcement agencies. And rallies and similar events are prohibited. In general, it always plays out the same way. People try to defend their rights, and then the police beat everyone with batons. Women, men, the elderly, children, and even those who were just passing by. One of those who was just passing by was Daria Sosnovskaya, who tried to stand up for another person, but ended up getting hurt herself. A police officer hit Daria Sosnovskaya in the stomach and then on the head. She was later diagnosed with a concussion and a bruised chest. Daria filed a complaint about the beating with the investigative committee. From there, the complaint was forwarded to the National Guard. The agency, stating its officers weren't involved, forwarded the complaint to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The ministry in turn stated that their employees were not involved in the beating. In an interview after this situation, Vladimir Putin stated that the protesters themselves provoke law enforcement officers, and that in order to organize protests, you need to get permission, which, it's easy to understand, no one will give. Russia is a country of people living in poverty and among ruins. A country where the constitution and human rights are just a piece of paper that their president uses to wipe his ass when it's convenient. What else is there to say? Keep putting up with it. And again, the question arises, the question of how a country that doesn't even have freedom of speech or freedom of choice can go and save another country that has all of that. Russian prison. You can tell how rotten the authorities in Russia are from a truly unbelievable story on a genuinely global scale. First, I'll tell you the story, and while I'm doing that, think about what consequences there might be for those who committed the crime. And then we'll compare your answer with reality. Belarus. Sergei Savelyev ended up in a Russian prison where there was mass torture, beatings, and abuse of inmates by the guards. So these guards just beat people for their own amusement whenever they wanted. And considering how the justice system works in Russia, there's no doubt that many innocent people are in prison, but that's a whole different story. The point is that Sergei managed to smuggle a 100 gigabyte flash drive through prison security, which contained video evidence of violence against inmates. Again, let me remind you that such videos are easy to find online. I'll even post one of them on my Telegram channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so. You can't really argue here about whether the guards are guilty or not. Here, the guilt is 100%, because the purpose of a system like prison is to rehabilitate a person so that they understand they were wrong and don't commit crimes again. But that doesn't give anyone the right to beat people. And now, to the outcome of this story. The head of the colony was fired, but not because of what his subordinates did to the inmates, but because he allowed this story to be leaked. The people who beat the inmates were not punished, and Sergei Savelyev, who was able to show everyone what was really happening, was put on an international wanted list. But fortunately, he managed to escape to France, where he was granted political asylum. I honestly don't understand stories like this. It's not a matter of personal opinion, like when one person likes Real Madrid and another likes Barcelona. Here it's clear and obvious that you can't beat people with impunity. But in Russia, somehow it works differently. A dignified old age. However, it's not just prisoners who are mistreated. In Sverdlovsk Oblast, there was an institution where people with disabilities and pensioners were sent. They lived there in terrible conditions. They were not cared for, they were starved, their passports and bank cards were taken away, and then money was withdrawn from those accounts. This story came to light thanks to a resident of Yekaterinburg, Irina Abdulina, who came to visit her ex-husband, who constantly complained about the inhumane living conditions. When the woman arrived at the shelter, she saw a terrible scene. There was an entire room full of paralyzed people, Abdulina said. If a fire had suddenly started there, everyone would have died. All these people had been without food for 2 weeks. There were only 3 bags there, one with oatmeal, one with peas, and one with millet. There was nothing else. When I went in, the place looked like a concentration camp. Emaciated old people moved around the rooms like zombies. And Abdulina called an ambulance, the police, and journalists. However, the medics who arrived could no longer help one person. As the woman said, one person lay naked on the floor for 3 days and showed no signs of life. He was taken to the hospital, where he died of exhaustion. The doctors couldn't save him. Someone had a cast on, and because there was no medical supervision, everything under it had already started to rot. Moreover, there was a woman in the shelter who was mentally ill and used to beat elderly people. According to her, people were sent to the shelter by social services, who promised that caregivers would look after the elderly. Doctors will regularly examine them, and they will have good meals 3 times a day. Children are the future of the nation, but not for everyone. Even children are subjected to violence in the aggressor country. Not long ago, information surfaced that at the elite Moscow school number 57, 2 teachers repeatedly sexually harassed students. The school administration knew about this, as students repeatedly filed complaints. What happened next is shocking. The school created a memorandum that prohibited criticizing teachers. Those who disagreed with it were simply expelled. Currently, these teachers no longer worked at the school and managed to flee to Israel even before the accusations were confirmed. A similar story happened at the Moscow Central Art School. Girls who no longer study there wrote 10 letters accusing the painting teacher Viktor Yelizarov of sexual violence and harassment. The stories are so harsh that I'm honestly disgusted to even talk about them out loud. If you want, you can find all of this in the news. It's pretty easy to find. Many times you've asked me to make a follow-up about the Russian world. What's it like living in Russia? What's going on there? Well, I can't refuse you. Today, here's another batch of news about the greatness of the Russian world, about how they live and what gives rise to such cruelty toward the people around them. I'm Semyon and this is Mega Show TV. Let's start. Russian Mother of the Year. In the village of Ozyablikovo, Nizhny Novgorod region, a woman hadn't bathed for 15 years. And locked in a cellar, she had no contact with the outside world. The reason? Her own mother locked her there for 26 years. All this time, already dubbed the Mowgli woman, she survived on cat food and spoiled milk. And her dwelling became a breeding ground for unsanitary conditions. The neighbors helped rescue the captive after they saw something shaggy, dirty, and in rags running through their gardens at 2 or 3 in the morning. They turned to journalists and social services, who only responded after public outcry. And after that, the woman was given a passport for the first time in her life at the age of 42. The most interesting thing in this story is that Nadezhda fully repaid her rescuers. She contacted the investigative committee with a complaint about illegal entry into her home. And a criminal case was opened against those who saved her. He froze to death. At the very beginning of 2024, 60-year-old captain of the Russian Navy, Vladislav Ivashkevich, froze to death in his garden plot in the Leningrad region. His relatives blame the power outage for this, since nothing works there without electricity. The captain's sister's husband said that the power outages started as early as December 29. According to the power company, the reason was snow on the wires. At the same time, local residents stated that it hadn't snowed for several days. How typically Russian is that, to mess things up and blame it all on natural phenomena. At the same time, the only source of heat in these houses was electricity. Most people used it to heat their shacks. On January 3rd of this year, the captain's body was discovered by relatives. In their opinion, the electricians knew that the power could go out at any moment during the holidays, and it's clear that no one would come to fix it. They still postponed the repairs, the eternal Russian hope that things might work out. And also note this, the Navy captain is spending his last years in a summer cottage in a gardening community. While Russia is trying to destroy Ukraine's critical infrastructure, its own infrastructure is killing its defenders. Is it possible on the other side of the Atlantic, for example, for a NATO captain to lead such a miserable existence? Let me not spell out the answer. The smart ones already know. No one called an ambulance for the dying man. A little over a year ago in Vladivostok, a 30-year-old man collapsed right on the street. And maybe he could have survived if any of the numerous passers-by had shown some compassion. But no. A woman walked by, turned around, but didn't dare to help. The driver of a car also ignored the man lying there. A minute later, another person just walked by. All of this was visible on surveillance cameras, and this isn't something I made up. In the end, for more than 20 minutes, people walked around the person and didn't call for medical help. In broad daylight, almost in the center of a big city, and only half an hour later did a college student call an ambulance, since the events were happening right outside his dormitory window, but it was too late. The man died before the medics arrived. There is an article in the criminal code, leaving a person in danger. Knowingly leaving a person without help when they are in a life-threatening or dangerous condition can result in a fine or even imprisonment. Why did people walk past the man lying there? One of the reasons could be widespread alcoholism. It's not that I'm trying to defend all the heartless passers-by, but in Russia, there's clearly a stereotype. If someone is lying on the street, they're either drunk or high. Let him just keep lying there, and the Russian authorities are only too happy about it. They ply everyone with booze so that people don't sober up and start thinking about the mess they're actually living in, but that's a whole other story. A frozen waterfall of an interesting color. Let's move to the other end of this so-called traditional values country. In Arkhangelsk, there's a local attraction, a unique waterfall made of sewage. And unfortunately, this is not a joke, but the harsh reality of today's Putin-era Russia. So, in this very Arkhangelsk, on Nikolsky Avenue, there's a wooden house, number 116, built before World War II. The original design of this house did not include separate apartments. There's a long corridor running from one end of the house to the other, with rooms on both sides of the corridor. In the 1960s, when the construction of apartment buildings began, people started wanting to move out of houses like these. The 70s and 80s passed, the USSR collapsed, socialism was replaced by autocracy, but the house is still standing, and people are still living in it. Well, if you can call it living, it's more like surviving, especially with temperatures of 20 below zero or colder lately. But the residents didn't reveal their main secret, and you can only see it if you walk around the house. And there, it looks a lot like lava from a volcano, but then, realizing where this volcano is erupting from, you understand, it's frozen waste from the toilet. It flows out and freezes immediately. The thing is, when the first frosts hit, the cesspit froze, but you can't forbid the residents from using the toilet, so after a while, the wall of the house was literally blown out by a dense stream of waste. It just so happened that the rupture happened during 30 below temperatures, so it's impossible to fully assess the scale of it. Residents are anxiously waiting for temperatures to rise above freezing. With the first warm spell, this piece of modern art will start to stink, and it will suddenly become impossible for everyone nearby to live. And now, an unexpected twist. Any propagandist would write about this. We all saw how in Kiev, in the Borshchahivka district, the whole area was flooded with sewage. And that's true. Yes, accidents happen everywhere. In Ukraine, in Russia, in America, and in China. This happens in every country. The question is how quickly it gets fixed and how the authorities and the people themselves respond to it. And here, there's a big difference. In Russia, it's normal for a situation like a frozen fountain of sewage to go unfixed and for officials not to be held accountable. And the residents themselves are probably used to it by now. Jail time for a phone conversation. It seems the previous news really hit rock bottom in every sense, but when reading the next one, as they say, it got even worse. Sergei Vedol is accused of publicly spreading fake news about the Russian army because of, get this, a phone conversation with relatives. When the lawyer pointed out that a private phone conversation cannot be considered public dissemination of information, the investigator replied that there was a witness to the conversation. Who could possibly be a witness to a phone conversation? Well, the witness was the person who was listening to his phone as part of their official duties. The person wiretapping the phone felt anxiety, fear, and a sense of being unprotected by the state. How do you like that twist? But since there is a witness to the conversation, it's no longer a private talk, but a public statement. Unbelievable! And the person who gave 18 years of his life working for the state apparatus was given 7 years. Barracks in the city center. Let's get back to the Russian realities in the field of construction. For years now, Russian propaganda has been flaunting videos aimed at the West, with a brief message that goes like this. Keep supporting Ukraine and we'll cut off your gas. You'll freeze to death. And where do you think our next story comes from? Geneva or Munich? No, it's from Yakutsk, the capital of the Sakha Republic, which is probably richer in mineral resources than all the countries of Europe combined. And yet people live like this. Practically in the very center of the capital of the Republic, from the beginning of the 21st century, you can easily find yourself in the early 20th century, and all without any time machine. In particular, along Lermontov Street, wooden barracks built in the 1930s stand one after another, and people have been living in them for decades. In the barrack with an outdoor toilet, which in winter can only be reached in felt boots, and in the spring and summer period in rubber boots because of the melted and stagnant water around the house. And in the barrack on Bestushev-Malinsky Street, there isn't even a toilet in the yard, and the residents have to walk around with their waste looking for a suitable place to dump it. Maybe in Bestushev's time this was normal in those parts, but it's 2024 now, and people still have to go to this yard to relieve themselves. People don't even really live in these houses, they merely endure a dangerous existence, waiting for the walls and ceiling to collapse at any moment. Instead of refrigerators, they have homemade boxes for storing food during the cold season. The doctors ran away, leaving the woman in labor to die. Since Soviet times, one of the main points of pride for citizens of the great and vast country was free healthcare. Well, let's take a closer look at this so-called best healthcare in the world. A couple of years ago in the Stavropol region, doctors drugged a 24-year-old woman in labor and went home. Diana was supposed to give birth to her baby at the hospital in the village of Kursavka, but at the last moment, her doctor decided to perform an emergency C-section. However, after the surgery, the young mother's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. At that moment, the midwife already realized that the situation was out of control. And then something unimaginable happened. Instead of providing emergency assistance, both doctors simply left the intensive care unit. Before that, they injected Diana with a double dose of medication. By that time, according to the same doctors, the girl had fallen into a coma, having lost more than 1.5 liters of blood. What made these executioners in white coats do such a thing? Maybe they urgently needed to save another young mother? Not at all. According to the 72-year-old midwife, she simply felt unwell at that moment. Her blood pressure went up. But another female doctor turned out to be even more original. The woman said that it wasn't her shift that day, so when her husband called her, she gladly left the dying patient. No one can say for sure yet whether 24-year-old Diana would have survived if at least one of the doctors had stayed with her at that moment or not. But one thing is clear, you can't leave a patient to die alone, even if it's not your shift. Remind me, please, isn't there a nation that actually prides itself on the slogan, "We don't abandon our own"? Of course, you could say that it could be anyone but Russians, but facts and most importantly, statistics are stubborn things, and they say quite the opposite. And how many similar cases are hushed up and hidden? So they remain forever a medical secret. But today I will declassify one more story. They locked him in the storage room. In his 2012 speech, the future defendant of the Hague Tribunal, named Putin, for the first time, clearly stated that Muscovy was experiencing a clear shortage. A shortage of what makes us who we are. The reason was educational, and this was an educational secret, something we were all proud of. That is, there were no such things as mercy, compassion, or sympathy. For more than 10 years, not only have they failed to get rid of this shortage, but in my opinion, it has become catastrophic. This is a story about the followers of Hippocrates who have completely forgotten their oath to the ancient healer. In a district hospital in Buryatia, the medical staff locked a 40-year-old patient in a utility room. Vladimir was admitted to the hospital with bilateral pneumonia. However, due to the patient's strange behavior, he was locked in the utility room. What was so strange about his behavior? Eyewitnesses said that a few hours before his death, the man was walking around the hospital, peeking into wards and trying to find a doctor. The doctors considered, just listen to this wording, the patient's behavior to be violent and locked him in a stuffy room. They put a lock on the door. The doctors only found out that the man had died the next day when his father came to visit him. When the doors opened, the father almost fainted. In the stuffy little room, his son was lying on the floor by the radiator. Nikolai Konstantinovich rushed to him and started performing chest compressions and artificial respiration himself, but it was all in vain. The medical staff didn't even try to take any part in the resuscitation. But that's not the end of the story. When his father and sister tried to pull Volodya's lifeless body out of the small room, they noticed that someone from the staff was placing Volodya's bag and phone next to him. You see, they locked him up without his phone, without water, and forgot about him. The autopsy showed that the man died from pulmonary edema. The attending doctor claimed that the patient was locked up for only 5 minutes, but the deceased's relatives do not believe this. Such mercy indeed. So much compassion and especially sympathy in the actions of the medical staff. In short, we don't abandon our own, unless we forget about them. Family values, and how could we not talk about family values? The very ones that set soulful Russia apart from the West that just won't rot. This won't be just one story, but a rapid-fire roundup. Let's go through all these very values and find out what's really happening in Russia. Respect for elders. On March 23, 2023, in an apartment in Moscow, a 49-year-old son strangled his mother with a rubber belt from a machine mechanism. And then, together with his sister, he took the body to the Ryazan region and left it in one of the abandoned houses. He explained to the police that the conflict with his mother had lasted for several months. The elderly woman did not want her son's girlfriend to live in their apartment. In fact, she was also dissatisfied with her son's choice. The man repeatedly offered to buy out his mother's share of the apartment and move out, but she refused. The housing dispute led to a conflict between close relatives and ended in a brutal killing. Family, loyalty, and love. A 14-year-old girl from Ulyanovsk, winner of the Little Miss Russia and Little Beauty of the Volga beauty contests, went to law enforcement to report that she had been raped. According to her, she ended up at a party with people she barely knew, including some young men from what is known as the Golden Youth. After getting the girl drunk, they assaulted her, committing violent sexual acts against her using improvised objects. According to some reports, one of these objects was a carrot. And how did it all end? Remember the status of the participants at this party, and knowing the realities of Russia, it probably won't be hard for you to figure it out. The girl and her parents were strongly asked to keep the matter quiet, because all the participants at that party were children of important people in the city. They said that among the partying kids, there was even a deputy's child. No one could end up behind bars, especially for something like this. In any case, the matter never made it to court. A 49-year-old handyman from a Moscow cafeteria found a lacquered chair leg at his dacha and brought it to his apartment, where he lived with his wife and daughter. On February 24th, the head of the family decided to continue celebrating Defender of the Fatherland Day. After drinking half a bottle of cognac, he wondered what the length of his rectum was. The experimenter decided to take the measurement with that very chair leg, which had been lying around unused and seemed to have been waiting for its moment. However, he couldn't manage to extract the half-meter-long measuring device by himself. He had to go to the hospital. The man himself considers himself an experimenter and is sure that he failed because he forgot to tie a string to the device. Following rituals, honoring the memory of ancestors. It's basically a royal flush of cases from different regions. In the city of Kamyshin, Volgograd region, unknown individuals desecrated the mass grave of the participants of the Battle of Stalingrad. They burned all the wreaths brought to the burial site and damaged the facade of the Eternal Flame Memorial. In Serpukhov, vandals spray-painted a swastika on the T-34 tank monument. In the Stavropol region, 3 young men were caught. They relieved themselves on the burner of the Eternal Flame. And what's most interesting is that in this rather mediocre theater of the absurd, in Russia, the blame for many of these cases will be placed on President Putin and his terrible management of the country over the past 25 years. Did you believe it? Well, of course, yeah. The Ukrainians are to blame again. They are supposedly giving instructions directly from Ukrainian territory to radical groups and neo-pagan sectarian groups. In the investigation materials, employees of foreign intelligence services, including the GUR and the SBU, are mentioned as coordinators. Well, how could there not be a Ukrainian connection? Neither will the water be sanctified, nor will a mother be strangled, nor will the eternal flames be desecrated. Russia is a country that is dying out. Putin shouldn't have started the war in Ukraine. And it's not just about the absolute impotence of his army and the utter stupidity of the generals, who only know how to steal and suck up to their superiors. Expansion, conquests, wars and revolutions can only be afforded by a country with a young and growing population. Russia definitely doesn't belong to this category. It is rapidly aging and dying out. And this is probably the main problem of Muscovy, which in recent years has ranked among the top 10 fastest shrinking nations in the world. Russia's population decline didn't start just yesterday. It has been going on for several decades. However, it is in recent years that this process has begun to accelerate rapidly. If we talk about specific numbers, we're talking about hundreds of thousands. For example, in 2020, the total decline of the Russian population amounted to more than 580,000 people. And in 2021, it was more than 690,000. In case anyone didn't understand, this is the difference between the number of people born and those who died in a year. Previously, some of the demographic losses were compensated by migrants, but after the start of the war, and especially after Putin announced mobilization, Russians themselves started fleeing their highly spiritual homeland in droves. They say that over the past month, more than 1 million people have left Russia. Moreover, it is the Russian ethnic group that is suffering the greatest demographic losses. For example, Chechens and other peoples of the Caucasus have no problems with birth rates. They can't be called dying out. The worst situation is in central Russia, in the regions of the far north and in the far east. Vast areas are becoming uninhabited, becoming deserted. In the last 20 years, when Putin and his St. Petersburg buddies have been in power, Russia has lost 20,000 villages, and most of them disappeared in traditionally Russian regions, for example in areas like the non-Black Earth region. Did you just hear what I said? In 20 years, 20,000 villages have disappeared. Not just 20, but 20,000, and that's only the official data. Actually, I'm more than sure that the real numbers are even more terrible. The population of many fairly large cities is also rapidly declining. For example, Nizhny Novgorod, Murmansk, Tula. The population of only one city in Russia is constantly growing. I think you know which one. Write it in the comments. Yes, Russia is the largest country in the world by area, but due to its relatively small population, a significant part of its territory is simply empty and brings no benefit either to Russians themselves or to the rest of humanity. This is very noticeable in photos taken from space. The lights of settlements are visible in the European part of Russia, along the Trans-Siberian Railway, in Transbaikalia, and in the Far East. All that distant territory is dark, a lifeless desert. Why is Russia dying out so quickly? There are many reasons for this. Starting with the low life expectancy of Russians, the ruined healthcare system, and the huge number of divorces. But all of this is secondary. Despite the crazy propaganda of family and traditional values, Russian women simply don't want to have children and have a huge number of abortions. On average, each of them has fewer than 2 children. Solving demographic problems is very difficult. It takes not just years, but decades and a well-thought-out government policy in this area. As global experience shows, it is quite possible to improve a country's demographic situation. But the worst thing you can do in such a situation is to start a big war and bury tens of thousands of men of reproductive age in Ukrainian black soil and turn tens of thousands more into invalids. Oh yes, and hundreds of thousands of young, active and well-off men fled from Russia after the announcement of mobilization. This is probably the largest wave of Russian migration since the Russian Civil War. AIDS epidemic. There is a real AIDS epidemic raging in Russia. According to statistics, Russians suffer from this deadly disease 10 times more often than citizens of the European Union. This is especially interesting when you remember that the main risk groups for the spread of AIDS are drug addicts and homosexuals. That's how it turns out. Kremlin propaganda screams about Orthodox values and family traditions 24 hours a day, while at the same time, the highly spiritual Russian people are dying out from a disease that most often affects people with a non-traditional sexual orientation. According to official statistics, at the beginning of 2022, there are almost 1.14 million people living with AIDS in Russia. However, most specialists who work in this field believe that in reality, there are actually many more infected people. Every year, 90 to 100,000 new cases of infection are recorded. Russia has long been among the world leaders in the spread of AIDS. It should be added that besides Russia, only African countries are on this list, and some Russian regions are even surpassing countries on the African continent. According to data from 2019, Zimbabwe was the leader in the spread of AIDS with 281 cases per 100,000 people. And right behind it, in an honorable second place, was the Kemerovo region, where 206 new cases per 100,000 people were recorded. For comparison, in the European Union in the same year, 2019, there were 4.9 cases per 100,000 people. Kuzbas can safely be called a disaster zone. Here, almost 1 in 10 people is infected with AIDS. Roughly speaking, almost every house or apartment building has someone living there who is infected with AIDS. But never mind prosperous Europe. Nothing like the Russian epidemic exists in the post-Soviet countries of Eastern Europe or Central Asia. There aren't such terrible statistics even in Afghanistan, which is the world's main producer of heroin. The situation could be improved by a broad public awareness campaign. For example, lectures about safe sex in educational institutions. However, in modern Russia, such things are completely forbidden. Instead, school children are taught about the structure of the Kalashnikov rifle. Meanwhile, the number of confirmed AIDS-related deaths in Russia has already exceeded 400,000 people. There is an extremely high level of drug addiction. One of the main reasons for the large-scale AIDS epidemic is the extremely high level of drug addiction in Russia. According to UN estimates, in 2008, Russia was the world leader in heroin consumption. Over the years, the situation has not improved much. Today, up to 20% of all Afghan heroin ends up in Russia. It's very difficult to even estimate how many people in Russia use hard drugs. The number ranges from 2 to 7.5 million people. In 2021, about 10,000 drug addicts died from overdoses alone. But in reality, drugs claim many more lives. People die not only from the substance itself, but also from the consequences of its use. These include AIDS, hepatitis, other serious diseases, mental disorders, and suicides. In the mid-2000s, a homemade drug called Crocodile became widespread in Russia, which can kill a person in just a few months. This substance literally causes a person to rot alive. First, the skin becomes covered with festering sores, teeth fall out, and then gangrene develops and organs begin to fail. The ingredients for Crocodile were freely sold in regular pharmacies and cost much less than heroin. Their production was set up by a pharmaceutical company that was directly linked to the former head of the Russian Ministry of Health, Tatiana Golikova. In other words, the components for the deadliest drug were produced under the protection of the top official in Russian healthcare. The spread of soft drugs and psychoactive substances is no less of a problem for modern Russia. They are extremely popular among children and teenagers, which makes them especially dangerous. In 2017 in Russia, twice as much methamphetamine was seized as in the entire European Union. The fight against drug addiction requires serious and well-thought-out government policy, especially since it represents a serious social problem. A significant portion of all crimes are committed by drug addicts. Drug trafficking is carried out by organizations, organized criminal groups, and corrupt law enforcement officers. However, instead of solving this most serious problem, the Russian leadership is waging war in a neighboring country, spending billions of dollars on it. Again, the question arises, how could a country as highly spiritual as Russia become a world leader in heroin consumption? And how is the production of synthetic drugs protected by the Minister of Health? Maybe it's not that spiritual after all? Alcoholism. Excessive consumption of alcoholic beverages is an age-old problem in Russia, which has always been considered a very heavy drinking country. However, in recent years, it has taken on the character of a national disaster, and many experts are already calling the current scale of Russian drinking a humanitarian catastrophe. In 2021, every resident of Russia over the age of 15 consumed 11.5 liters of alcohol per year. This is not a world record, but the consumption of alcohol among different age and social groups is a serious problem. Traditionally, rural areas in Russia suffer the most from alcoholism, and the more depressed the region, the more people drink and the less attention they pay to the quality of the beverages. This quite naturally leads to a large number of alcohol poisonings, suicides, crimes committed under the influence of alcohol, and cases of domestic violence. Alcohol consumption is lowest in Russia's Muslim regions. The president of the Russian Anti-Cancer Society, David Zaridze, stated that 50% of deaths among the Russian population aged 15 to 54 are related to alcohol abuse. And this concerns not only poisonings, but also accidents, murders, suicides, as well as a whole group of serious diseases that alcoholics suffer from. Even more alarming figures were presented by the Russian Ministry of Health. According to their data, alcohol is to some extent responsible for the deaths of 70% of working-age men. Every year, 40 to 50,000 people in Russia die just from poisoning caused by various alcohol substitutes. Young people in Russia really have started drinking fewer strong alcoholic beverages now. However, they have replaced them with beer, which has caused an outbreak of so-called beer addiction. In addition, among teenagers, alcohol is being replaced by various psychoactive substances, which is even more dangerous. In Russia, they try to fight alcoholism through administrative measures, but this is not very effective. The Russian countryside drinks because of unemployment, lack of prospects, and a general lack of any positive outlook in life. It is unlikely that the current Russian authorities will be able to change anything in this matter, and it probably doesn't concern them much anyway. A leader in the number of abortions. Despite all the tales about the high spirituality of Muscovites, Russia is among the world leaders in the number of abortions. For example, in 2020 there were 450,000 surgical abortions performed. In Ukraine, for example, the number of abortions is significantly lower, less than 65,000 procedures. In Russia, the Orthodox Church led by Comrade Gundyaev is actively opposed to abortions, as well as a number of politicians who consider themselves conservatives and statists. They say that the Russian nation is dying out, so Russian women should have more children. We need soldiers. There were even calls to ban abortions at the legislative level, but the State Duma rejected them. In order to have fewer abortions in the country, we need to develop a culture of family planning and ensure that women want to have children. Putin needed to focus on the economy and social issues, not start wars with neighboring countries. Premeditated murders. As the cherry on top, Russia has a very high level of violence, and we're not talking about some fights, but about serious crimes, premeditated murders. According to open data, there are 8.2 murders per 100,000 people in Russia every year. For comparison, in the US, this figure is 5.35, and in Ukraine, it's 4.6. In the US, where firearms are freely sold, the murder rate is lower than in the so-called traditional values Muscovy. You understand why I'm talking about the US, right? Putin is always saying, do you want it to be like in the US, like in Ukraine? Do you want it to be like in Paris? For many decades, the USSR and later Russia invested huge resources into creating a virtual image of the Russian people that has nothing to do with reality. Books were written, movies were made, where Russians were portrayed as generous, fair, and selfless. All of this is fake. We saw the real Russians in Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol. I hope you found this video interesting and that it opened some people's eyes to the real Russian world. And I want to ask you, what do you think about this video? Anyone want some Russian world? Okay, that's it. Comment what the next video should cover. Glory to Ukraine.